I want you to turn to Luke chapter 16 as we are back in our study in Luke. I remind you, this comes right on the heels of the three stories that Jesus tells really as one parable in Luke 15. Now, if you can't imagine that there's no chapter break here, that part's not inspired. The words are inspired, but those chapter and verse divisions, somebody added many centuries later. Luke didn't write chapter divisions. I'm glad we've got them, so I can say to you, turn to Luke chapter 16, verse 1, you know exactly where to go. But sometimes they put a little mental break there that the author didn't intend. Remember, we're not just looking at what each story says, we're looking at what the author is doing with the story. And I want you to see the connection between this story and the story of what we call the prodigal son. Remember, it's really the story of the compassionate father with the two disobedient sons. But there's a lot in common. This is considered one of some authors consider this the most difficult of Jesus' parables. But I think if you take out that chapter division and you read it with eyes that have just read the story of the prodigal son, I think it makes a lot more sense to you. So read with me, beginning in chapter 16 and verse 1, but keep in mind what we studied about the prodigal, all right? He also said to his disciples, all right, so look, right there. In fact, this is in Greek, it's in the imperfect tense, which means he was saying. So it can mean that he said it several times. So I think this is one of those stories Jesus sort of repeated. And Luke is telling us that in the same way he told the story of the prodigal, he was also saying this to them in the same vein. There was a rich man who had a manager, a steward, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said, "What's this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager." And the manager said to himself, oh, we've heard that before, right? He said to himself, "What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses." So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, "Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, "How much do you owe?" He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you've not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Now, can we just admit this is a puzzling parable? Because it sounds like, Jesus is telling about a guy of unsavory character, an unscrupulous steward, a manager of someone else's money, and he's dishonest, and then he seems to compound his dishonesty by telling debtors to just take some off of what they owe. And yet Jesus tells the story, and at the end of the story, the guy who's cheated by this dishonest manager commends him for his shrewdness. Now, this is so puzzling that there's been a lot of debate and discussion about this through centuries. Julian the Apostate, the Roman emperor, who was the last pagan emperor. In fact, he was like a great nephew or something of Constantine, who made the Roman Empire Christian. Julian the Apostate, though raised Christian, turned back to paganism for the 2 years that he was basically the emperor of Rome. And this is one of the passages that he pointed to, and he said, this right here, this proves that Christianity presents an inferior moral ethic. And he said, well, look right there. Jesus is commending bad behavior. Jesus is commending sin. And so Julian the Apostate rejected this completely. The New Testament scholar Craig Blomberg says, of all Jesus' parables, this is probably the most puzzling. It is certainly the one on which more scholarly ink has been spilled than any other. But I'm sort of in the odd lot here, because I don't think it's as puzzling as we may think at first. It's sort of a story like, okay, you've been getting bills from the hospital. You had some treatment at the hospital, and after a while, an administrator calls you, says, I'll tell you what, take your bill. Can you pay 50% of it? Well, yeah, I can pay 50. Then cut it right now. Pay 50. If you'll pay 50% of it, cut it right now. That doesn't sound so odd to you, does it? Now, if later you found out that the hospital administrator did that without anybody over him giving him permission to do it, it might seem odd to you. But hey, if somebody that works for the hospital tells you to cut your bill 50%, what are you doing? You're cutting your bill 50%. And what if an IRS agent called you and said, you know that settlement about you had to pay so much in arrears, cut that by 20%. We're taking 20% off of that. Amen. Would you take that as good news or not? It would seem good news. Now, this is what I want you to see, is that we've got to look at this through several sets of eyes in the story, because you've got basically three sets of characters. You've got the master, you've got the steward, but then you've got the folks in town that owe this guy, that owns all the crops, from whom they borrowed during perhaps a time of famine. And to them, getting their bill cut would be good news. And they don't know the backstory, right? They don't know that this steward has been fired. All they know is they used to owe more than they now owe. When you look at this story in light of the story of the prodigal son, the story of the compassionate father, you see several things in common. Each has a noble master who demonstrates extraordinary grace to a wayward underling. In one case, it's a son, and one, it's a steward. Both stories have an ignoble, unscrupulous character, a son or a steward, who waste their master's resources. In each story, the wayward person reaches a moment of truth where they realize the mess they're in, and they come up with their own solution to how to fix it. And both of them count on one thing. That is the goodness and grace of the master. Both parables deal with broken trust and the problems that result, and the way that the father or the master views this broken trust. Now here's the question. What can we learn from this parable, the story of the dishonest manager, sometimes called the unjust steward? Call him what you will, we all get it. The question is, how can God possibly commend this guy? I think it's helpful for us to realize that Jesus often sort of appeals to unscrupulous characters to illustrate spiritual lessons from some aspect of their behavior. Sometimes they're called contrast parables, where Jesus points to someone like an unjust judge, and he won't listen to the widow who keeps petitioning him for justice, but she keeps on asking and asking and asking, till finally, though he won't do it because He's just. He'll do it just to shut her up. And Jesus uses that to illustrate why we should just keep praying. What he's doing is he's sort of arguing from an if an unjust judge would do it, how much more would your just God do it? If this master views this way, how do you think God views it? There's a thief who surprises people in the middle of the night. Jesus says, well, that's the way you should look for the Son of Man coming. A strong man who has to be tied up in order for his house to be plundered. I mean, that's not the kind of image we think of Jesus throwing out there, but Jesus often draws lessons from these rather unscrupulous characters. And in the parables of Jesus, whenever you've got two main characters, if one of them is bad, the other one is good. You never have a parable of Jesus in which you have two main characters and they're both bad. And I say that because there are some interpreters that have tried to interpret this by the master himself being dishonest, and it's through his own dishonesty he views the unscrupulous character of his steward and says, what a smart guy. I reject that entirely because Jesus never has a parable where both main characters are ignoble. If there's an unscrupulous, ignoble character, the other one is noble. And I think you see here a lot about this master's character. When the master gets this information that his steward is being dishonest, notice the way he handles it. He could have walked in and had the guy arrested. He could have booted him out right then. But frankly, he's very, very gracious, even in the way he calls him to account. Listen to him. He goes, what's this I hear? But he's not asking for information. The language here dictates like this is a farming scene because the stuff that has been loaned is basically crops, measures of oil and wheat. So this is probably the wealthy landowner in a time of drought and low productivity. People have had to borrow from him or buy from him when they didn't have it to pay. And they said, next year's crop, I'll return the oil to you. I'll return the wheat to you. But man, my family's hungry. And so this is the guy who's been productive when other people have not. He's had stuff when other people are going without, and they've had to come to him. So it looks like an agrarian scene, but this master is very generous. He doesn't just have the guy thrown into prison. He actually tells him there's going to be an accounting. He fires him, and he says, now, I want you to turn in the books. But even in the way he does it, there's grace. What a lesson for us. I think Jesus is reminding us that we don't own anything. We just manage it, right? Everything you have belongs to him. It's his air you're breathing. It's his life you're living. All the stuff in your bank account, he could wipe out in a moment. He's allowed you to have the ability to earn or to inherit, to work, whatever it is you've got, God has given it to you. You don't own it, you manage it. About 1/5, about 20% of all Jesus' parables have something to do with money. And almost all of them are designed to show that money doesn't mean what we think it means. We think it means security and safety, and Jesus' parables are designed to show us it's not that at all. Remember the parable of the rich fool who said, man, look how well I'm doing. I'll build more barns. That's his solution. My problem is I've got so much I don't know what to do with it. My solution is I'll build more barns so I've got more stuff. Jesus says that night his soul would be required of him. You fool. You fool. Jesus called him a fool. And what was Jesus saying? You don't have security in what you own. Don't plan on tomorrow. God is the one who's in control of everything. That money doesn't give us security. And furthermore, this parable teaches us that we will give an account for our stewardship of life itself. Remember, Jesus is a preacher and he's preaching. His main subject is the kingdom. He's looking forward to the time when the kingdom is going to come on earth. And he's preaching like John the Baptist, telling everybody, you better be ready. And this is no different than that. This is Jesus saying there's coming an accounting. You better be ready. You better be prepared, because you're going to have to stand before God and account for this life that you've been given. And Jesus often employs some kind of scene of reckoning or accounting between masters and servants as a metaphor for the final judgment. A major theme of Jesus' ministry was warning of this final reckoning and teaching people how to be prepared for it. And so when the master comes, he doesn't say, is this true? Notice he doesn't say that. He knows it's true. What's this I hear? You've been cheating me. You're no longer my steward. Turn in the books. There's an accounting coming. And by the way, this, what would you expect? Think, if you can, put on your Middle Eastern thinking cap. And what do you think a Middle Eastern steward would say? What would his response be to this? If there's any question about this charge at all, he might say something like, oh, beloved master, I have served you faithfully for 25 years as my father served your father and my grandfather served your grandfather. How can you do this to me? He doesn't say that. Or he might say, I want to know who has made this accusation. Bring them in here so that I can look them in the face and hear their charge. How dare they accuse me of any kind of dishonesty? He could say, oh, Master, this really isn't my fault. I've been faithful, but these people, they cheat at every corner and you just can't trust them and they don't repay. He says none of that. He's completely silent. No argument, no denial, and I don't care what culture you're in, silence in the face of an accusation makes you look very guilty. See, we don't measure up to God's standard, do we? When we're told that there's a reckoning coming, we're going to have to give an account to God for our lives and everything in it. We really don't have much to say. From Adam onward, sinners confronted by God have never successfully offered an excuse for the evil they've done. Now, plenty have tried. It's just not worked out very well. We don't measure up to God's standard. So now Jesus lets us hear the conversation. There's a soliloquy at the middle of this parable that's very common in Jesus' parables. You have sort of the setup of the problem in a couple of stanzas, if you will, and then you have the main character, here's what I'll do. I'll build more barns. Oh, here's what I'll do. I'll go back to my father and I'll say, I'm not worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired servants. I'll work this off. What does this guy do? He says, man, jig's up. There's no plan B. I'm too weak to dig, and I'm too proud to beg. Wow. What a line. It might be my favorite line in all of Jesus' parables. I'm too weak to dig. I'm too proud to beg. It strikes me that there are a lot of so-called preachers that aren't really called of God who go into the ministry for exactly that reason. There's no calling of God on their life, but man, they're too weak to dig, they're too proud to beg, and so they pretend to follow God. Man, there's no plan B. When you come face to face with the fact that your accounts are short, you can't answer to God. You have wasted your life. You have squandered what he's given you. You have used it for your own selfish purposes. You have not honored him with it. You got nothing. You got no plan B. You don't get to take a pass or offer an acceptable excuse. You can't just beg your way out of it. You can't work your way out of it. The debt is too great. God has you dead to rights. He knows you're guilty. You know you're guilty. There's no plan B. Now, this bad steward can't change the past. He doesn't offer a denial, an excuse. He does not question the charges against him. What he does is he can't change the past, so he changes the future. He gets a goal. I need to be received into somebody else's household. I'm getting kicked out of this one. So I need someone else to receive me into their household. His declared goal is to be welcomed into someone's household. That's just another way of saying to get another job. Now, if he is simply fired for corruption, once this gets out in the village, who's going to hire him? Nobody. No one would receive him into their household because he's a bad manager. He's a dishonest steward. Who wants that guy? So what he has to do is ingratiate other people to him so that once it's public, well, he did me a favor. He might have cheated that guy, but he was good to me. I'll take him in. I'll let him work with me. Now, I want you to notice that sin begets sin. Don't miss that in the text. It's not the main point, but the fact that he's been dishonest leads to his solution being to be dishonest yet even more. Okay, I've cheated my master before. The only way out of this is to cheat him again. That won't work. But one sin always leads to another. So he calls debtors. He calls them in to meet him. They know he is this man's steward, and they've dealt with him in business before on behalf of the master. They don't yet know that he's been fired. That's just between the steward and the master, right? And so he goes into action very quickly. Notice that word's used. Do this quickly. He calls him in. How much do you owe? I owe 100 measures of oil. Okay, quick, write it down. Write down 50. Really? Yeah, write down 50. Hey, how much do you owe? I owe 100 measures of wheat. Okay, cross that out. Write down 80. Now, what's he doing? By getting the debtors to write it, he makes them co-conspirators. If the master protests, they're guilty too, right? So what he's doing is he's trying to raise the stakes where these people will receive him, right? Because when the master finds out about this, there's just one of two responses. And one of them is, I don't care what he told you. You owe me 100 measures of oil. You owe me 100 measures of wheat. That's one possible response. And by getting them to write it in their hand, here, you write that, he's made them guilty with himself. And so the likelihood that they'll receive him into their household rises. Now, 50 measures of oil was worth about a year and a half's worth of wages. That's no small debt. 20 measures of wheat, about the same thing. So once this gets out, all right, he's made these deals on the side with the debtors, and the master hears about it. What can he do? Well, he can go into the village and legally declare with his full right that this was a bogus deal, that the reductions were not authorized, and he can demand full payment. But now let's just think, what's going on in the village when all these debts have been canceled? What are they doing? They're throwing a party, right? Whoa, half my debt just got taken off the books. I'm happy. And the guy who's sort of the lord of the manor there, the main landowner, if he goes in and he does that, what kind of feelings is he creating toward himself? They're going to resent him. I mean, this guy ruined our party. Even though they know he's right, that would certainly make them gripe about him. It turned their little party into a gripe session. I can't believe that guy, he's got so much and we have to pay him back. So instead, the second alternative is that the master can simply remain silent and take the loss himself and enjoy his reputation as a generous man. And that is precisely what the bad steward counted on from the beginning. Now, don't miss this. The one thing he knows is the generous character of the master. He figures it all out. There's no way he's going to make them pay the full thing. And he's going to get rid of me. That's going to happen. But these people will be grateful to me, because the one thing I can count on is that when that deal is made, he's going to forgive them the debt. You see what he's thinking? He's planning on what he does right now, ensuring his future. And this is what Jesus wants us to get, that what we do today affects tomorrow. That your actions today affect what happens the rest of your life. And this is when Jesus tells us, when the master sees this, he's impressed with the guides, and the word the ESV uses to translate it is his shrewdness. He's certainly not complimentary of his character. He knows his character. He already knew his character. He's confronted his character. His character is worthless. But man, at least he had the sense to do something that would help him after he got fired. And though the master doesn't praise him for his abilities, he praises him for his shrewdness, because once he knew that the accounts were coming due, he made adjustments. Look what he did not do. He didn't keep living as though he weren't going to have to face the music. In fact, knowing that he was going to face the music, he took actions that would help him after he was let go publicly. He began to ask himself, what can I do to provide a soft landing for the inevitable consequences of my past actions? What Jesus is getting at here for you and me is not just that what we do today affects tomorrow. He wants us to see that what we do today affects eternity. Because this is when Jesus says, don't you get it? That this guy is a son of this world. He's a son of this world. He's not one of the sons of light. But at least he had enough sense to use what was at his disposal right here and right now to look to the future and to provide for himself a way to land softly so that they would receive him into their houses, their household, their habitations. And Jesus says that's what the children of light often don't get, is that the very reason you have anything that God has given you is for you to use it for eternity. The only thing worse than being a dishonest manager is being a stupid one too. What if you're told that you have to give an account and you know that your accounts are short and you just keep living like it's not so? Jesus says the sons of this age are wiser, more shrewd, because they use their money to provide a comfort of a kind. I had no way of planning this. In today's New York Times is an article about Michael Bloomberg and how in the run-up to his current run for president over the past several years, how he has very strategically donated billions of dollars. And there's this map. The graphic is just super cool. If you pull it up on your browser, it shows this big pool of money that he's donated. It shows a map where all of it's gone. Kentucky has been the recipient of some of it. And then it shows how much of it goes to political causes, how much of it goes to philanthropic causes. And they are saying that, man, all along what he was doing was planning on this presidential run that he is now doing. And boy, as I read that article this morning, I thought, how timely. This goes right along with what Jesus is saying. The sons of this age are wise in the way they use their money to get others to receive them. And he said, the sons of light just often miss that thing entirely. We don't get that what we do today affects eternity. Children of light often seem to refuse to acknowledge that they only have a stewardship and that they're going to give an account, and that they better use the resources entrusted to them to lay up treasure in heaven where they will be received into eternal habitations. See, the only good use of money, according to Jesus, is to affect eternity. Jesus says this over and over and over and over. What you have is not yours, it's entrusted to you. So if you are living like it is yours and using it to provide comfort for yourself in this life, Jesus says, you're not just honest, you're stupid. Because in eternity, that money's not going to help you at all unless you use it in a way that it benefits those who are going to receive you into eternal dwellings. What you have is not yours, it's entrusted to you. And if you're mismanaging God's resources, Jesus says that's not very shrewd. It's not very shrewd. And he goes on to say, if you're not faithful in the little things, how's anybody going to entrust you with big things? If you're not faithful with the temporal, how's God going to trust you with the eternal? If you're not faithful with someone else's stuff, how do you think you're ever going to have something that is genuinely yours? Long ago, I heard the story of a man who was the CEO of a major corporation, and he was looking to come up with a transition plan. Who would be his successor? And he was going to work with a board to choose his successor, and this was a very private thing. No one knew that he and the board were working through this. And he was one day going through the cafeteria line there in the cafeteria of their headquarters building. And in front of him in the line was one of the vice presidents who was on the short list, unbeknownst to him, to be the next CEO. And the current CEO was back several places in line, and he was just watching this VP go through the line. You know, it was cafeteria style, where every little thing had a price on it, you know? And here was the rolls, and each roll was like 50 cents, you know? And then beside the rolls were little pats of butter. And the little sign said, butter 3 cents. And he watched this guy, a VP, put a piece of bread on his plate and then pick up one of those pats of butter and tuck it under the bread, where when he checked out at the cashier, he or she would not see the pat of butter and charge him the 3 cents. And the CEO got back to his office after lunch, and he crossed a name off of his list, because he said, if you can't trust him with 3 pennies, you sure can't trust him with 3 billion. Isn't that exactly what Jesus is saying? If you aren't honest with the small things, you're not going to be honest with the big things either. When it comes to serving God, think small. Little things matter. We often spend so much time coveting after people that God has given greater exposure to, or they have a bigger platform than we do, or more Twitter followers than we have, or whatever. And we're jealous. We think, well, why doesn't God give me that? Why doesn't God allow me to have that talent? Why don't people see this giftedness in me? Why don't I get the pats on the back like they do? And we think that we'd be faithful to God if he'd give us some big job, some big platform. But you know, God is watching the way you do the little things. You know, when you're alone with your computer and no one will know, what do you look at? When you have money your spouse doesn't know you have, how do you spend it? when God gives you a windfall, unexpected income. And do you think about self or do you think about kingdom? See, the way you handle money demonstrates the way you regard eternity itself. Because if you're spending your money only on what it accomplishes in this life and in this age, then what that really means is you don't have regard for eternity. That you are happy to have the benefit here and now and to forego the eternal. Jesus says, man, even a dishonest steward has more sense than that. Even an unjust manager knows that there's a future and an accounting coming, and he better use what he has at his disposal right now to make sure that that works out for him. And Jesus says, if you've not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who's going to entrust to you the true riches? And of course, how ironic that the one who's speaking these very words is himself the embodiment of the true riches. He is the pearl of great price. He is the field with the hidden treasure. You see, the way you handle money demonstrates the way you regard eternity, and you either live for unrighteous wealth or you live for true riches. The dishonest steward is condemned for his actions, but he's praised for his confidence in his master's gracious nature. Hey, if I know my master, the one thing he's not going to do is make these guys pay that themselves. He'll take the loss. He'll pay the price. Isn't that exactly the character of God? You see, the gospel is the greatest wealth. And how you invest it determines who's going to be there in heaven to receive you. Man, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but I just got to tell you, being pastor of Buck Run, I am privy to so many glimpses of God's grace at work and people who are investing to receive eternal dwellings. Charlotte, I see you back there, man. Charlotte raising 3 children. I mean, she's a college student. She's raising 3 children that are not hers because she cares about eternity. And you know what? Charlotte asked Seth and Candace to keep those children this weekend, not so she could have some time to herself and some me time and to go to a spa and get a mani-pedi. And I don't mean there's anything wrong with those things. Don't misunderstand. That's just not what Charlotte wanted to do. You know what she wanted to do? She wanted to attend and serve at Disciple Now and to pour her life into students. So Seth and Candace kept her 3 with their 4. I bet they've had a fun weekend. And Charlotte's poured her life into young ladies in her group, and I think I heard one of them trusted the Lord Friday night. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. There's a steward who's going to be received into eternal dwellings. You see, your decisions emanate from the deity you worship. This is what Jesus says. If money's your God, then you're going to make decisions about your money based on that being your God. If God is your God, then you're going to make decisions about your money based on God being your God. But it turns out the theme here is really not about money as much as it is about God and sin and salvation all along. It's not merely about honesty and dealing with your money, as important as that is. It's about knowing who God is. That I can use what He has entrusted to me because I know He's going to pay the cost. He already did on Calvary's cross. Because if you know who God is, then every action, every decision you make is going to emanate from that. You might be too weak to dig and too proud to beg, but be smart enough to put your faith and trust in the God whose character you can always trust, that He will pay the price for you. See, worship takes the form of love and service. If a son of this world knows the character of God and that shapes his behavior, how much more should you know it? It's true, there's a reckoning coming. You will have to give an account of what you did with the life that God entrusted to you. But you have mismanaged your relationships. You have squandered your gifts. You have distorted your personality. You have twisted your own perspectives. There's an accounting coming. What will you do? I'll tell you what you do. You can count on the Father's character to be both just, because He requires payment for every sin. He will be just, but He will be merciful. Because He loves you so much, He wants to spend eternity with you, and He Himself will absorb the cost of your sin. That's what He did through Jesus Christ on Calvary's cross. How can you face this reckoning that's coming? How can you stand before God and give an answer for all that you've wasted and squandered and selfishly used? How can you stand before Him and answer on the day of judgment? There's no plan B. But Jesus is God's plan A. And if you know His character, you know He'll absorb the cost.